Conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés. God's greed in the collapse of a civilization. The Empire of the Sun, a sacred world meets an ambitious intruder. In the spring of 1519, Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from Extremadura, driven by ambition and disobedience, sailed from Cuba toward the unknown mainland of Mesoamerica. Officially sent to explore and trade, Cortés had grander visions: conquest, riches, and eternal fame. As his 11 ships touched the sandy shores of Veracruz, Cortés and his 600 men beheld a coastline unlike any they had seen, humid, green, and rich in mystery. They planted a cross, held mass, and burned their ships, ensuring that there was no return, only forward. Unbeknownst to the Spaniards, they had arrived on the doorstep of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world, the Mexica, known to us as the Aztecs. At the heart of their empire stood Tenochtitlan, a city of causeways and canals, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. It housed hundreds of thousands of inhabitants and boasted grand pyramids, sprawling marketplaces, and floating gardens. The Mexica worldview was built on cosmic balance. The sun survived only through sacrifice, gods demanded blood, and time itself was cyclical. The Emperor Montezuma II ruled over this empire with divine authority, but lived in a world increasingly shaken by omens. Comets, eclipses, deformed births, and strange dreams troubled the court. News of the bearded foreigners with thunder sticks and shining skins only deepened the emperor's fears. Many interpreted the events as signs of the return of Quetzalcoatl, a god said to have vanished eastward, promising one day to return. This myth would shape and distort much of the early encounters. Cortés, for his part, was a skilled manipulator of perception. Though his force was tiny compared to the Aztec armies, he understood power, its symbols, its fragility, and how to twist fear into advantage. From the outset, he began forging alliances with indigenous groups who resented Aztec tribute and oppression. The Totonacs were the first to join him. Later, he would meet his most important allies, the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had resisted the Mexica for generations. With diplomacy, intimidation, and firepower, Cortés turned enemies of the empire into stepping stones toward its heart. Diplomacy and deception, the road to Tenochtitlan. As the Spanish marched inland, their small force ballooned into a multicultural army. The Tlaxcalans, after bitter initial battles with the Spaniards, saw in them a divine tool of vengeance. Together they carved a bloody trail through Cholula, a sacred city allied with the Aztecs, where Cortés orchestrated a massacre to send a chilling message. The massacre was justified under suspicion of conspiracy, whether real or fabricated, and it served to solidify fear-based dominance over local populations. But Cortés's most powerful asset was not a sword or musket. It was a woman, Malintzin, later known as La Malinche. A Nahuatl noblewoman given as tribute, she quickly became indispensable, interpreting Nahuatl and Maya, translating not just language but intent, nuance, and power. More than a translator, she was Cortés's voice and ear in a world of labyrinthine political webs. Her legacy remains deeply polarizing. Traitor to her people or survivor of patriarchy and empire? Moctezuma watched all this unfold with increasing dread. Instead of confronting the Spaniards in battle, he sent emissaries laden with gold and rare feathers, hoping to satisfy their hunger and perhaps dissuade them from entering the sacred valley. It had the opposite effect. The more gold Cortés saw, the more he believed that the Aztec Empire was built on limitless treasure. On November 8, 1519, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. The city was unlike anything seen by Europeans. Sparkling canals, precise urban planning, marketplaces teeming with exotic goods. The Spaniards were housed in one of Moctezuma's palaces and treated as honored guests. But the admiration was matched by paranoia. Cortés feared assassination, while Moctezuma was torn between reverence and fear, hostage to omens and ancestral responsibilities. Soon, Cortés made a bold and fateful decision. He took Moctezuma captive in his own palace, installing him as a symbolic puppet. The emperor, now under Spanish watch, continued to address his people, but his words no longer carried divine authority. This act shattered the sacred balance of power, and the city began to boil beneath the surface. La Noche Triste and the collapse of a civilization. By mid-1520, the fragile power balance within Tenochtitlan had become unsustainable. The Spanish presence, once cloaked in ceremonial diplomacy, had devolved into outright domination. Moctezuma, still officially emperor, but now a shadow of his former self, spoke to his people under the command of foreign invaders. The Aztec nobility watched with unease. The gods were silent, the rains were late, and the empire was unraveling from within. Then came the spark. While Cortés was away confronting the Spanish expedition, led by Pánfilo de Narváez, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him, he left Pedro de Alvarado in command of Tenochtitlan. Alvarado, paranoid and deeply ignorant of Aztec customs, committed a grievous error. During the sacred festival of Toxcatl, held in honor of Tezcatlipoca, he ordered the massacre of Aztec nobles, priests, and dancers, gathered unarmed in the main plaza. The Spanish sealed the exits and slaughtered hundreds, swords crashing over drums, blood spilling over feathers. The result was immediate and explosive. The people rose in fury. When Cortés returned, he found the city engulfed in rebellion. The Spanish barricaded themselves inside their compound, besieged by thousands of warriors. In a desperate attempt to calm the storm, Cortés forced Moctezuma to address his people. But this time, the crowd did not listen. They hurled stones at their once revered Tlatoani. Moctezuma was struck in the head and died days later, betrayed by gods, empire, and foreigners alike. With their food supplies dwindling and escape routes closing, the Spanish prepared for a nighttime escape. On June 30th, 1520, they attempted to flee across the Western Causeway during a moonless night, but the Aztecs were ready. In canoes and along the causeways, they attacked with vengeance. Warriors fought like jaguars unleashed. The weight of gold carried by fleeing Spaniards dragged them into the lake's depths. Others were captured alive, their hearts cut out in ritual revenge atop flaming temples. This was La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. More than 600 Spaniards died. Most of the native allies were slaughtered. Only a broken remnant escaped into the hills, led by a wounded Cortés who, according to legend, sat beneath a tree and wept. But Cortés was not defeated. What followed was one of the most ruthless, calculated military comebacks in history. In Tlaxcala, he regrouped, rearmed, and planned. He built brigantines, warships designed to dominate Lake Texcoco. He rallied a massive coalition of indigenous enemies of the Mexica, some fighting for revenge, others for survival. And as the Spanish prepared their assault, a silent killer moved ahead of them: smallpox. Introduced by an infected African servant, smallpox spread through Tenochtitlan like wildfire. With no immunity, the population was devastated. Entire neighborhoods died in days. Priests, generals, even the new Tlatoani, Cuitlahuac, all fell. The disease sapped the spiritual and military strength of a civilization already under siege. In May 1521, the final siege of Tenochtitlan began. The Spanish and their allies encircled the island city by land and water. Aqueducts were cut. Supply lines were strangled. Day after day, brigantines shelled the city's defenses, while warriors stormed causeways in a deadly push-pull of attrition. The Aztecs fought with inhuman resilience, turning homes into fortresses, refusing to surrender. But hunger, disease, and despair tightened the noose. By August, the city was broken. Its canals were clogged with corpses, its pyramids blackened by fire, and at last, Cuauhtémoc, the young warrior emperor, was captured. As Cortés gazed over the ruins, he may have imagined glory, but what he had truly conquered was not gold or gods. It was a civilization in collapse, pushed over the edge by plague, betrayal, and the terrible momentum of empire. From ruin to resistance, the shadow of conquest. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 marked the end of one of the greatest cities of the pre-modern world. But it was not the end of its people. From the charred ruins of its temples and the blood-soaked stones of its plazas, a new order rose. The conquest of the Aztec Empire ushered in a seismic transformation of Mesoamerica: cultural, spiritual, demographic, and ecological. Cortés, once a rogue adventurer, now stood as the self-appointed governor of a vast and broken land. He declared the founding of Mexico City atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Spanish masons and priests arrived. Temples were torn down. In their place rose cathedrals, colonial mansions, and government halls. The sacred stones of Huitzilopochtli's pyramid were used to build churches. The empire of the Mexica was erased, stone by stone, god by god. But even in victory, Cortés found no peace. Though he wrote extensively to the Spanish crown to justify his actions and plead for support, he became entangled in political rivalries. Accused of excessive cruelty and greed, he was stripped of much of his power. In Spain, he was both celebrated and feared, a conqueror who had acted without permission and whose fame threatened royal authority. He died in relative obscurity, bitter and alienated. For the indigenous population, the aftermath was catastrophic. Disease, which had already taken perhaps half of the population before the conquest, continued to decimate communities in waves. By 1600, some estimates suggest that over 80% of Mesoamerica's native population had perished from epidemics. Not only smallpox, but also measles, typhus, and influenza, often compounded by starvation and warfare. The Spanish introduced the encomienda system, a form of forced labor disguised as feudal stewardship. Indigenous communities were divided, relocated, and exploited. Their lands were seized, their political systems dismantled, their languages suppressed. Human sacrifice was outlawed, but so were traditional dances, religious rituals, and oral histories. Catholic priests burned codices, the written memory of centuries of knowledge and empires of ignorance and zeal. Yet the conquest was not absolute. Indigenous resistance continued, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle. Nahuatl continued to be spoken. native religious practices persisted, cloaked in Catholic forms. Saints took the names of old gods. Corn, amaranth, obsidian, and spirit survived, as did identity. The story of Malintzin, once seen as betrayal, began to evolve into something more complex: the origin of mestizaje, a new mixed identity born in trauma but rich in resilience. The colonial order that followed created a hybrid world: Spanish law overlaid on indigenous land, European theology entwined with Mesoamerican cosmology. The children of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers grew into a new social caste. And in the centuries to come, this fusion, often unequal, often violent, would become the seedbed of modern Mexican identity. Today, the ghosts of the Conquest still haunt Mexico's streets and imagination. In the murals of Diego Rivera, Cortes and Moctezuma appear not just as men, but as metaphors. In the poetry of Octavio Paz, La Malinche is not simply a mother or traitor, but a symbol of cultural rupture. And in every ritual, every celebration of Dia de los Muertos, every Nahuatl word still spoken, the resistance endures. What fell in 1521 was a world. What rose was a scarred but living civilization.